going live. Hello, everyone. Let's see who's joining now. They'll come filing in. Okay. Okay. So we'll just give it 1 second. Sorry for the late start, everyone. We had a little bit of technical difficulty, but it's all working out now. Okay. And a couple of folks are asking for some help here. Okay, we should begin. Give me just one moment here. We have one more having trouble. Of course, they always message me about it. Sorry, guys.
No.
Okay. Okay, good. Thank you, Whitney. Okay, so we'll just get started. I think folks will come in and out and follow along on Slack and things like that. So then, of course, we're going to post this to YouTube later. So we have today with us two really illustrious folks in the Indian business community. We have Indrajit Gupta, who is, he's been with the Economic Times, the Times of India. He was the founding editor of Forbes India, and he split off to found his own media startup called Founding Fuel. And I'll let him explain a little bit more about that in just a moment here. And we also have Anirudh Dutt, and he is with an unnamed large investment firm in the United States. If you follow investment news or the investment community, you've definitely heard of it. Unfortunately, we're not allowed to talk about that because he's not supposed to represent the company in an official capacity, but they're large and they do a lot in India. So he's been with CLSA, and that's when I met him, and other firms. But I'll let them say a little bit about themselves. Indrajit, how are you?
Thank you, Julian. All well.
So tell us a little bit about Founding Fuel.
Yes. So Founding Fuel, we kind of started about 5 years ago. It's largely cross between a media and a learning platform. So what we're doing is trying to fuse storytelling, something that I did for the best part of my career as a business journalist and editor, but not stopping there, saying that, look, is there a way to kind of create a learning platform for the entrepreneurial community in India? And we've defined entrepreneurship a little more broadly. So it's a cross between organizations that are large and established who need to be entrepreneurial, and startups and smaller enterprises that really need to learn how to scale. And we've kind of built a fairly interesting network of entrepreneurial leaders who work with us to do both, create content which is distinctive, as well as learning solutions that help them meet their business challenges. So that's in a nutshell what Founding Fuel does.
Excellent. And Anirudh, a little bit about yourself, and the firm that cannot be named, but is there anything you'd like to say about yourself and your experience and what you're looking at mostly these days? Oh, and also your book, Half a Billion
Sure.
Rising.
So hi, good morning, everyone. Sorry. So I've been working with the firm for now almost 7 years, and I describe my role as more like a roving India analyst. So keeping an eyes and ears open for developments in India, trends in India, which cover a broad spectrum of economic issues, the political development, policy developments, etc. And depending on requirement of the firm, I also work on various sector-specific issues or company-specific issues, because finally, at the end of the day, we are investors. And prior to that, I've had a career on the sell side as an analyst for over a decade. And for between jobs, I took some of to write a book called Half a Billion Rising, the Emergence of, which was looking at what's happening in this space in India, about what was changing, what are the changes for the positive, and what are the drivers for change, etc. So happy to be here. Thank you, Julian.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a great book. Certainly, Indian women are on the rise and doing interesting new things in ways that I think would surprise folks who haven't been watching that story. So, so folks out there, definitely give it a look, and also log into Founding Fuel to get a really good view into what's going on with business on the ground level in India. So, so India has been in the news internationally lately. Everybody, of course, is having issues with coronavirus, but India is a special case because of its size, the nature of the Indian landscape, and I mean that geographically. You have migrant workers who travel across India to go back and forth between home and work, and the government of India abruptly shut down the country on a 21-day mandatory stay-at-home order. And this caused a lot of issues with folks trying to get home, taking trains, buses, and in some cases walking. And I'm curious to know what are your first impressions about India and its experience of coronavirus, and what you think this means for business right now. Let's start with you, Anirudh.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So it's a very broad-based question. So India's first case of coronavirus was on January 29th, if I'm not mistaken. And I think the government was fairly swift in moving into, before the lockdown stage, actually trying to restrict foreigners from visiting India, cancelling tourist visas, and various other measures as it progressed. And clearly realizing that India has a huge lacuna in terms of health infrastructure on the ground, both in terms of manpower and physical, and in any way you can think of it. To give an example, for a country of 1.3 billion people, we have probably about all of 70,000 ventilators across the country. By the end of this month, we will have probably 100,000. So that's the kind of paucity of infrastructure that is there. So we could no way have lived with if the coronavirus had spread with the speed at which it did in many other countries around the world, whether it's Italy or a city like New York or US, etc. And realizing the spread, therefore, and the government abruptly, as well, with the 4-hour notice, locked down the entire country. And in a country like India, and you have visited India a fair number of times, and anyone who has visited India knows that's difficult to, social or physical distancing, personal hygiene of washing hands for 20 seconds, n number of times a day, are luxuries which you, I, or Indrajit can afford, but a large part of the Indian population, for them, it's a luxury at the end of the day. So knowing those constraints are locking down the country also has issues. Now, the images that the world has seen is mostly of migrant workers headed home, as you said, walking, hundreds of kilometers. But primarily, that problem has been limited really between Delhi and Uttar Pradesh. It's been far less elsewhere. And I usually draw an analogy of this about the Great Indian Wedding. Things start in a way and then kind of settle down into, and at the end of it, the end result is that a happy wedding takes, everything goes smoothly. So it's a bit like that. We still don't know the end outcome, but what we know now is that India is testing very few people, but it's testing, therefore there's a protocol, it's testing the high risk group, initially people who have come back from overseas or have had contact with people who have traveled from overseas, etc., high risk countries. People who have traveled back, putting them into self-quarantine compulsorily for 14 days. And remember, this is mostly from the top end of the society in some ways, which is the good part of this, in the sense it didn't start in the slum and the high-dense, poorer neighborhoods of cities and metro cities. Now on that, if you look at it, if you're testing high-risk people, however few the tests may be, but the infection rate is still about 4%. I was looking at percentage total infection to cumulative tests. So if you look at it, it's consistent around 3.5%, 4%. If I look at the percentage of daily new infection to the total number of daily tests conducted, it's in the region of 0.4 to 0.7%. If you look at the morbidity as well, the death rates, it's been consistent around 2.5, 2.9, 3.5% of infected people. So in that sense, while we are testing less, there is still reason to be optimistic that there's not been community transmission, at least on a huge basis. There might be pockets of transmission, and I think the government within limited constraints has done well. And similarly, the state governments have also been at the forefront, and probably the state governments have been more at the forefront. The local level have been doing a very good job. Again, given all the constraints that India is well known for. But what the lockdown does is completely has shut down the entire economy. And this has never happened before, at least in living memory out here. Initially, when it started, the slowdown, I thought it was more like demonetization. We had experience of 45, 46 days of, the country being in some kind, not a lockdown really, but the economy slowing down dramatically. But I think this is far worse. The damage to the economy is significant. And I would think that the fiscal year, which has just started, will end with negative nominal growth. And with the first quarter being the worst of it. And across sectors, the damage is there. And particularly painful will be medium, small, and micro enterprises, especially those in the informal sector, where probably we'll see hundreds and millions of at least temporary income loss, if not. I mean, these kind of enterprises bounce back, they come back into the system, but that process will be painful, and the income loss will be painful. So right now we are seeing a supply side constraint everywhere as retail stores are shut down, malls are shut down, people are reducing their consumption. Once it all starts coming back, as and when it does, I think you'll see a major demand supply shock as well in the country. So economically bad times, you will see NPLs rising and non-performing loans. And we entered into this with the financial system being fairly fragile. It becomes weaker. And therefore, what we need, along with the government's tough measures in terms of lockdown, etc., is also, as it tries to break the chain of the virus spreading, also to come with fiscal support program, which is fairly large, as we are seeing probably from governments around the world. And that's been a big disappointment so far. I'll stop here and hand it over to IG.
Thanks, Aniruddha. I think you've covered a lot of ground, so I'll just kind of build on some of the things that I see from a more business lens. You've done a great job of, kind of sketching out the economic and to some extent the political and the business things. But I think this has certainly come on the back of probably one of the worst demand slowdowns that we've had in the recent times, at least in the last 20 to 30 years is what most experts would think. So the coronavirus impact on business has certainly been, I think, amplified and magnified largely because business was a lot of parts of the economy, and a lot of businesses and industries were already on very, very weak, shaky ground. Look at construction, look at, to some extent, the large auto industries. And those are the ones that in some ways employ casual labor, migrant labor. And that's one of the reasons why this has come on the back of already a very significant contraction in demand. Now, was anyone really prepared for it? The answer was no, because the national lockdown perhaps was imperative, but we really didn't get time to plan for this at all. Things came to a grinding halt where trucks across the country carrying goods was suddenly came to a grinding halt. Like Aniruddha said, malls, cinema, multiplexes, retail outlets, everything. And on top of that, I think what also happened from a business lens was that we were confronted with a whole new beast, which is work from home. India is not necessarily a very strong work from home culture. So a lot of businesses struggle with that because initially there was a restriction. You couldn't have more than 50% of people coming into work, after which I think it became, when the national lockdown started on the 21st of March, 100% of people had to work from home except for some essential services. Now that was a huge disruptive issue because unlike most other parts of the world, we are not necessarily geared to work from home. Our homes are not really equipped, especially in cities like Bombay, smaller dwellings, not necessarily adequate bandwidth to really be able to work seamlessly from home. And there are many kinds of jobs that you can't really work from home. So so that was another source of disruption for business across the board, whether it's small or big. I think a lot of leaders and a lot of business folks really struggled. I know in America, this happened much earlier, and I think we've kind of eased into work from home as a regular part of business culture. But there were lots of companies that didn't have any formal work from home policy because, well, they never believed in it, never thought they'd need it. But suddenly to be pitchforked, there were offices, workplaces that actually physically moved chairs, desks, laptops, desktops into people's homes, right? Because they were not prepared. It was incredible because I think what I've heard from the conversations I've had with leaders, everyone's kind of scrambling to get used to this way of working. And it's not just businesses, it's schools, learning institutions, everyone is moving to online. So that's one positive thing that we've almost been cajoled and forced into embracing digital. So a lot of digital laggards that really struggled to embrace Zoom and Skype and everything else have been forced to do it. So teachers are on Zoom, CEOs who really believed in FaceTime, at work have been forced to kind of be on conference calls. I know some of them are spending as much as 12 hours on Zoom every day. But having said that, I think you mentioned the whole specter of migrant labor crisscrossing the country, being pushed into shelters, kind of scared and without a roof on their head, without a meal, really. It's been a humanitarian crisis. And I think that will in some ways certainly influence policy as well to a large extent, because a lot of, I think, community action has come through, which is heartening in terms of organizing meals, and but a lot of them may not necessarily find it safe to come back to work in kind of businesses, construction, as well as auto and several other businesses that depend on migrant labor, because they're just simply scared and they don't know what will happen. So it's a triple whammy in some ways. There's a health crisis because you can't step out, right? There is a mobility crisis as well, in the sense that you can't step out for work. That's not allowed under the lockdown. And there is an economic crisis. People are like already starting to lay off people, or if not lay off people, at least start cutting salaries. So on the whole, it certainly looks bad and it looks ugly.
Yeah, for folks who haven't, traveled around India, is certainly not seen how folks work out there. Migrant laborers, they depend on their workplace for food and shelter in many cases, and so having to go home or having the shutdown happen means that, you know, it's not, they're not getting paid, they don't have money, they don't have any place to stay, and and they're not eating. So it's just absolutely tragic to think about them. So what's happening? Like, what is the government doing about this? What do you expect the government to do? And third, what is the Indian style of crisis management from a policy perspective in moments like these? And I'm thinking of, you know, the financial crisis and various other periods where, you know, it can give us perhaps a snapshot of ways that the government of India naturally thinks about handling these kinds of things. Since we're looking at you, Indrajit, how about you first?
Yeah, so I think what's happened so far is that people are still, I think, playing a wait and watch game. The government, the Reserve Bank of India, central bank, has kind of issued a moratorium on loans, but most people believe that's not enough. So do I. I think there's a feeling that we're going to wait till the 14th of April to see if the lockdown is extended. Only then will we be able to figure out what is the kind of help and fiscal support that we might need to provide. But at this point in time, I think it's still, for most part, wait and watch and trying to tackle and cope with the health crisis. So a lot of the attention, as maybe rightly so, is focused on addressing the enormous gaps that we have in our health system. Aniruddha spoke about ventilators, the masks being produced on a mass scale, massive provisioning for isolation wards and quarantine facilities as well, because we're expecting the peak to happen sometime, probably the end of May, June. It's not clear. So I think the government seems to be looking at a sequence, saying that fight the virus first, look after poor people next, and then kind of deal with issues of business, and see what that needs to do. The worry, of course, is that are we kind of likely to lose time, and by which time, as Aniruddha was mentioning, a lot of small enterprises will certainly go belly up, because they kind of gasping for breath. There's no transactions happening for many days now, on top of a bad, very, very bad economic situation. So it's not just a liquidity problem, it's also going to be a solvency problem as well. So I don't know what the answer is. I think there's certainly looking at job losses and all of that. The government's, I think, on its own, tried to kind of urge businesses to be more responsible and not lay off people. But I'm not sure how businesses are going to be in a position to pay for salaries and wages in the short or in the medium term. In the long run.
So Anirudh has a great view on the policy process through his involvement with various kinds of organizations. Anirudh, what do you think is going to be the fiscal response, and any ideas on how this is likely to play out from an Indian style of crisis management, how the government of India approaches these kinds of things? Like, what would you expect to see, and what's necessary to address some of the issues that Indrajit just mentioned? And
right. So I totally agree with Indrajit. Yeah.
I was just going to mention, so we've got a lot to cover in just a little bit, so I'm just flagging that for us. You were saying?
Okay, sure. So very quickly, right, exactly as Indrajit said, there will be sequencing, and that seems to be the step that the government has taken. The first step is about saving lives and contain the virus. The livelihoods can be spoken about later. The informal system in India kicks in. We saw that during demonetization, the society steps in, and somehow people survive. They may go hungry for a few days, income, they go back to their villages, but life goes on at a lower level, at a lower consumption level or wherever, but it settles down to a new normal. And I think the government has taken that view, and initially focused on ensuring that the virus doesn't spread. Now, whether they're successful or not remains to be seen. The base assumption is that we are successful. Warm weather helps. There are various research on whether BCG vaccination helps or whatever. So let's hope with luck and this early lockdown, etc., we don't get to the worst kind of situation which the rest of the world has, or large parts of the world has seen. After that, the fiscal response, the two things what government will do, I don't know, right? If one thing this government has lacked right from the first term and progressively gone weaker in its second term is economic heft. People with enough economic bandwidth that could speak in a voice which is strong enough and push the government or nudge the government towards policy measures which probably are good for the larger economy. And we have seen some senior advisors leaving and the replacements have been really weak. And with that constraint again, now I know that the government is seeking advice from a wide variety of organizations, institutions and enterprises, including industry and businesses, etc. Now, what they will do, I don't know. One can be prescriptive. So currently, as Indrajit said, some measures have been taken, but they are really minuscule and do not go far enough. I think what the government needs to do at one end, stop worrying about leakages and stop worrying about targeting benefits, but open the floodgates for essentially cash transfer and transfer of food in kind to the poorer sections of the society. That's the number one step, which is immediately necessary. Civil society feeding people is not a solution for the long term, number one. Number two is then it needs to take care of the smaller businesses and the corporate sector. And here again, they have to, as I mentioned, and I also mentioned earlier, that we were entering into this at a weak economic growth and a fragile financial system. We need to ensure that the government gives the backstop of guarantees to ensure that the banks then lend to the small and medium and micro enterprises and the larger corporate sector. It has to result, RBI has done a few things, but the government needs to really backstop. RBI on its own cannot do this. And what should be the size of this? I don't know. My own estimate, I was doing some budgetary calculations, trying to look at what the revenue shortfall will be and where the expenses could be, what the government can do. This government can easily take up a burden of, if it does an additional fiscal support of say 2% outside of the budget, then assuming all the shortfalls, etc., given the new economy and the windfall from the oil, you have to remember one thing, India really benefits from the lower oil prices. It's not oil, it's oil consuming nation. It imports 90% of its oil requirement. It's a huge beneficiary of that. Putting all that into account, the government, probably central government's fiscal deficit can go up to as much as 8%. Now, this is very high, and to take the off-balance sheet item, probably it rises as much as 10. Take the states, then the total deficit of the countries in the region of somewhere between 13 to 15%, probably as much as high as that. Can we take that kind of fiscal burden? 15% maybe not, but can we do 10 or 12? I think we can. And there are ways and means. For example, the government's fiscal deficit cannot be monitored by the RBI as per law. That may need to be changed temporarily as an exception given this crisis situation. So these are prescriptive. I don't know what the government will do, but it will need to open the really what the rest of the world has done, fiscal support, and then in tandem with monetary support.
So as we, thank you. And so as we look at the needs of the folks on this call, you know, I always tell folks that if they want to figure out how to do business in India, they better watch how Indian companies interact with Indian people. And what are you expecting to see, and how are folks interacting right now? I know that you've been covering under the theme of survival, Indrajit, you know, how companies are forging away. I mean, it's still early, of course, but what are you beginning to see in terms of methods of economic survival, and how foreign companies interacting with folks out there can learn from that?
Yeah, sure. So there are, I think, 3 or 4 things that are happening. One is that I think obviously at this moment, you've got to deal with the operational issues around the crisis, right? That's priority 1, so that you can stabilize the business, at least bring a modicum of stability, which means 2 or 3 things. One is there's a big effort to try and kind of repurpose assets, right? So there are lots of companies that have, because there's no economic activity happening, they've transformed their factories to make ventilators, to make masks, repurpose hotels into or resorts into healthcare facilities, right? So there is a stream of work that's happening on that front, because you've got to do both. You've got to I think large companies certainly are being kind of called upon to support the national interest in some ways, and that includes some multinationals as well. The likes of Uber, for instance, are being kind of called in to partner with companies to try and kind of get essential products delivered home. And that's important because there's no store that is open for essential goods. I mean, the government's kind of urged you not to step out of the house. So delivery for all kinds of things, especially essentials, is just mounting. So there's an opportunity there to play a part in ensuring that both meals as well as groceries are kind of delivered home. So there's a line of work there. Clearly, there is a lot of work going on behind the scenes around how to restructure costs in a dramatic sort of way without laying off people to start with. But I don't know, there will be some layoffs for sure in the startups that we're likely to see. But to start with, I think lots of companies have already started announcing salary cuts, anywhere between 50 to about 30%, depending on what, you know, your seniority level and all of that. So some of that is quite worrying. A lot of IIT graduates, for instance, who were sitting on job offers, their offers and placement offers have been cancelled. We're hearing more and more stories of that. The other is if and when there is a need for a financial ventilator from the government, what form and shape will that take? So there's a lot of discussion going on in the industry associations to arrive at some principles on which this is done, right? Obviously, the need is the greatest amongst the small and medium-sized enterprises. Normally, when you hear about Indian enterprise, you normally come up, you think that, you think of the Tatas and the Birlas, you think of Infosys or a TCS, but in reality, they're just a very small, minuscule part of our entrepreneurial enterprise system, right? Entrepreneurial system. So it's largely smaller firms, in some cases, even solopreneurs who are really, in terms of sheer size, comprise the largest segment. So what do you do for them that would help them at least survive, live, and hopefully kind of stabilize and bounce back once the market comes back? So I'll stop there.
For technology companies, I'm also kind of interested. I mean, here we've had Zoom, of course, do extremely well through all of this. I think it was pretty surprising to them. And then Slack, anybody who's facilitating the work from home technology stack is going to be doing well. But that's got me thinking, especially after the introduction, you know, internet is an issue in you know, from time to time in India. Speed, functioning, things like that. I think it's gotten better in recent years, but what do we see going on with the tech companies in India, either the foreign ones or the domestic ones, and how they're adjusting and succeeding or not?
So Julian, there's been a bit of a challenge on that front because we've obviously positioned ourselves as a large offshoring destination really here, but a lot of it is on the back of you know, work that needs to be done in a development center. You can't do this from home. It's not easy. Some of those transitions have happened. You'd have to understand that the likes of TCS and Infosys do a lot of work, which is what is called you know, time and material based kind of billings, right? So you get paid based on the number of people that are working on that project, and they have to be physically present. How do you monitor someone sitting at home? It's not easy, right? So that's going to be an issue because a lot of banks who outsourced work to India, I don't know how comfortable they'd be to move to a work from home situation. So I think the software industry, NASSCOM, has really requested for a little more time, but I think that's one thing that we certainly don't have. And any cases of coronavirus at the workplace resulting in offices being shut. So this is going to be a pretty tough situation for the tech companies. Some of them certainly do have work from home policies, but when everyone's working from home, it takes on a completely different hue. So there are issues of data confidentiality that are not easy to solve. So this is going to be a bit of a, and for the business processing outsourcing, the more of a challenge, because clients may or may not may be comfortable working out arrangements with a TCS, but for a small BPO outfit in Bangalore, it's going to be very hard for them to persuade large clients to really relocate work home. So that's something that's it's still something that we'll have to see how that goes.
What are your thoughts on that, Anirudh?
So if I may add to that, yeah, if I may just add to that, you know, the initial reports are that the large outsourcing companies like the TCSs and Infosys of this world probably working at about 60% efficiency from the numbers that I've roughly heard. And the BPOs are really more challenged. And the issue is also about the level of technology and the confidentiality and everything else. But the softer part is that, like I said, with social distancing, a large part of India's workforce cannot work from home. It's a luxury at the end of the day for most of us, and certainly so for the BPO staff. And I know of mid-sized companies which are struggling with this. Productivity is down to 25%. So while it may not impact what Reuters does in India or Goldman Sachs does in India, it does impact what smaller companies in India are doing. Having said that, like you mentioned Zoom, Slack, etc., I think the only good positive thing about India entering into this COVID at this stage has been that we have had this launch of Jio a few years back. And given that the availability of, I think, broadband connectivity, etc., at least on that front, there are far many more number of people connected today, and the availability is, I would say, is better. I mean, even 2 years back, I don't think I would have been able to do this call sitting at home. And while it's not Jio, it's a Airtel Connect, but even they have been giving good service.
Well, that's good. That's good. So,
but Jio is clearly.
So I wanted to turn over to questions. We have some interesting folks on here. People following along, if you have any questions, please write them in the Slack group so that we can discuss amongst ourselves, and it's easy to kind of you know, have a discussion later and so on. So we had a question from Whitney, our wonderful collaborator on this project. She said, I'd be interested to know what the government is doing in support of the economy at this point and what you think would be ideal. And I think that we've handled that issue. But she also said, she also asked, are you seeing internet shutdowns during the lockdown, which that has been a sticky issue for India lately in certain parts of the country. Has that complicated anything, the internet shutdown trend? What do we think about that, Anirudh?
Okay, no, you know, the internet shutdown was in the news one when the Kashmir issue cropped up, and India changed the law that has been in existence since almost independence to change the status of Kashmir. That was one. And then there was the issue of when these protests were going on in Delhi, I think there were some big shutdowns that we had seen. That was around December and January. I don't think right now internet, even in Kashmir, I think most of the restrictions were removed even for COVID-19 started making its presence felt. And rest of the country, I haven't heard any issues about internet shutdowns. I don't know whether Indrajit has heard something.
No, so but certainly I think the bigger problem is really around fake news and WhatsApp emerging. WhatsApp, as you know, is hugely popular in India. So that's been a bit of a challenge. There are lots of rumors and fake stories doing the rounds, which have obviously raised anxiety levels when people read them. So the government has kind of, in some ways, responded with their own data platforms that give you more authentic news. But one of the issues that has happened, unfortunately, Julian, I don't know whether you've heard about it in Bombay, for instance, we're not getting any delivery of the newspapers. And in India, that's a fairly unusual phenomena. Where I don't think I've ever seen a situation where papers haven't got through. But there've been a lot of fear that, you could get infected if you touch the newspaper. So that's slammed shut. So that's in some ways fueled a lot of demand for digital news, which may not be a bad thing. But the government, I think, has not, done anything.
And while fake news, while fake news has been one of concern, there are also concerns that the excuse of fake news could be used by a government if it wanted to control media. And that's a legitimate concern. But I think in today's day and age, that's very difficult in a country like this.
So what do we
legitimate concern? I wouldn't worry too much about it.
What do we think about how India is going to rebound from this? Obviously, nobody really knows when things are going to get back to normal or become less acute. We have estimates, we have hopes, but what do you think it will start to look like when India does start to bounce back? And I mean, from an Indian consumer point of view, from a business to business point of view, how quickly do Indian consumers start to feel confident again? How quickly do businesses feel like investing again? And of course, the example that we can look back on would be, demonetization and other phenomena in recent years. Like, what did you see during those circumstances that inform a view, and what's your what's your hunch, both culturally and personally?
So, Julian, I hope we have an answer for you that even is half credible, because it isn't. It's very difficult to map and model what's really going to happen, because a lot of it depends on the extent of the lockdown. So on April 14th, if the lockdown is lifted, and it's looking more and more uncertain, because each of the states across the country, I think, seem to be suggesting that they want this extended. So the impact on business is already pretty formidable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if it continues till the 1st of May and beyond, you're looking at series of job cuts. So whatever recovery that we're now talking about, the economic recovery, certainly is going to be it's going to be fairly painful and long drawn, because no one's going to come back, and we're a consumption driven economy. So no one's going to come buying cars and refrigerators and all of that for a while, because I think there's fear and foreboding about the future, and we're still not in a position to guess how long it'll take for the virus to subside and for us to have the confidence that this is behind us. China is emerging out of it, but we've had situations in Hong Kong and several other places where it's come back. So I think it's very, very difficult to guess what sort of, and the stock markets and everything else have kind of taken a massive beating as well. So all in all, I think it's unfortunately doom and gloom, but this is the time when you can really press the reset button and do a lot of the long-term structural changes that we've kind of hoped to see. Whether we'd see it or not remains to be seen, but there is clearly an opportunity to do things differently.
What's your view on
it? So, if I may add, I agree with Indrajit that this will be very long drawn out. During demonetization, I was quite positive. I was not as gloomy as most commentators were, having traveled through most of the industrial areas and seeing how quickly things were bouncing back. The difference was, I think, the economic production did not get locked down. What happened was an informal credit system kicked in, and you could see that fairly quickly, within a matter of weeks, and at worst about 8 weeks, things were bouncing back to pretty much near normal. I think this will be far more long drawn out, because the migrant worker who's gone back home would not come back the moment the lockdowns are eased in phases. And increasingly, it's looking it will be a phased-wise easing of lockdown. And I can easily see the conversation in every home being, what is the rush to go back? you are getting enough to eat out here in the village. Let's wait and see how things are. Let's see whether it comes back or not. Everybody is well informed today. That's one thing we have to admit. And it's the same thing like what I'll be telling my son about when he has to go back to the US university, for example. It's the same conversation that's happening in every household in a different manner. So I don't think the production can immediately jump back. Migrant workers, when they go back, to get them back takes weeks and months. So it will take that weeks and months to get them back. And there are also people who have not been able to go home, who are now dying to go back home. So you'll see a fresh flood of migrants, workers actually headed home when you see some kind of normalization of long distance travel transport, like the trains and the buses being opened up. So therefore, I think it's much long drawn out. And the loss of income is real. And given the loss of income is real, I think consumption also doesn't bounce back, except for the top 2, 5 or 10% at best of the pyramid, of the economic pyramid, where it doesn't matter to people like us about how we spend. So the moment things open up, after a few days of caution, we would like to go out and eat. And if in July a travel option is available, we may travel to Europe or US or wherever. I don't think the rest of the country does that. So this slowdown is a little more prolonged. It will be a long run, and maybe a U, maybe a L-shaped, God knows what, but certainly not a V-shaped one. And if there's a second phase of it, remember, immediately after the summers, we have the monsoons, when normally diseases and infections kind of peak in India. And this time you have a new uncertainty on top of that. But having said that, if you look beyond the immediate and beyond even the near term, clearly this is probably another opportunity for India, God-sent opportunity in some ways, where it can wedge into the global supply chain in some ways, try to play a more meaningful role about how the policymakers, how Indian entrepreneurs, how MNCs do that. We know that now the optionality risk of being too dependent on one country for supply chain is huge. It's a 6 Sigma event or a 9 Sigma event, but I don't think companies globally would want to be married to that, or not have an alternate reasonable manufacturing base. So if that is how the world develops going forward, maybe there's an opportunity for India to look forward to. But that seems too far away right now.
So when we think about how India has bounced back from situations, right, demonetization, and the financial crisis, what did that 5 to 10% at the top of the pyramid that most of the folks on this call, other than like the nonprofits, would be interacting with, what were the notable features of their behavior? And the reason why I point that out is that saving is a much more prominent characteristic of that class of Indian consumer and citizen than, I think most folks in the West. What do you expect from that top of the pyramid layer?
See, look, during demonetization, there was a blink and in the global financial crisis, India had a blink and you miss it kind of moment, because it was a more crisis. The stock markets came down, but Indian businesses really did not suffer as much. And given the fiscal stimulus, which was immediate, even the consumer bounced back quite rapidly. And companies which were in distress at that point of time, I remember by January of 2008 or January of 2009, I think, January of 2009, they were raising funds. The companies like Unitech, which were basically belly up, which would come back into the markets and raise funds in the global markets. And there was really a blink it and you miss it kind of moment. Demonetization may have been a little more prolonged, but even again then, the top 5, 10, 15% was just not impacted, right? And therefore, it was business as usual pretty much for everyone. And those who got impacted, remember, even that class probably had some opportunities to make money at that point of time. As you know, for example, our driver or a worker somewhere was converting currency for someone and making 20% of it. And therefore, we really don't know the real story. It was very complex. But this one is very stark. And therefore, I wouldn't compare it to any of the earlier two events that you mentioned. This is very different, I think. And the pain is real this time, far more real.
Yeah. So in looking at those instances, I'm not saying that they're even close, right? I mean, the thing about this is that we've never experienced anything like this in our lifetimes, and so I think what I'm trying to do on this call is to find things that folks might not necessarily think about as reactions to how India is going to move, right? So anyway, we can move on, but is there anything that we can look at that the folks on this call might be able to research that would give them some insight into how things are likely to play out? And I mean, the comparisons are constantly difficult, right? Like we can think about how the government responds to crises like the tsunami, right, of the mid-aughts, or the kind of mobilization that it might have taken just after partition to unify the states. I mean, you have to really stretch back to start finding the kind of response and interaction uh, that folks can point to and say, okay, we're looking at this kind of behavior. But do you have anything like that? Is there anything cool that
Look,
people
India gets its act together during a crisis. I'll let Indrajit speak more about it. He observes these things more. But when I think about it, for example, we have this every 12 years, something called a Kumbh Mela in Allahabad, where 10 million people or more than 10 million people gather in a matter of a couple of weeks. And mostly, again, poorer people, rich people, all kind of people. It's a religious gathering. A lot of foreigners come in there to see what goes on there. And it happens in the state of Uttar Pradesh, which is probably the largest state, but also probably the most, one of the least well-governed states. But they manage it perfectly with tents and toilets and cleanliness, and it's unimaginable, unbelievable. And I think some of that is playing out now in a way. I've been surprised to see in rural areas, for example, isolation centers being put up. I would never have imagined that. I'm surprised that when migrant workers are getting down from a train or a bus in some remote corner of India, someone is actually taking their temperature. Obviously, some of that is being faked, some people are escaping, but the fact that temperature is being taken in some remote corner of India by some bureaucrat standing out there, low-level bureaucrat from the government machinery, is in itself is amazing actually to me in some ways. And that's working right now. So India comes together in a crisis. As I said, it's a great Indian wedding. Lot of chaos, but you end up delivering in the end. So will it be another one like that? I hope so. Am I sure? I'm not. But I'll let IG take this forward.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything that's comes remotely close to what we're going through now. There's been, Aniruddha will remember the Bengal famine, which people talk about. We were not even born there. We talk about the Surat plague or the tsunami that hit southern India. But this is a tsunami at a different scale altogether. I mean, I don't think there's any parallel. I asked this question to another panel a few days ago, and they said, look, well, this is stuff that one has read in the past about the Spanish flu and everything else, but this is a completely different beast altogether. So I'm not sure that that's really going to be very helpful. And I do agree with Aniruddha that we do sometimes, maybe a little belatedly, rise up to the challenge in moments like this. It's I guess, the survival instinct at play. But it does expose fault lines as well. The underinvestment in health, for instance. So one of the things that will certainly going to happen now is a lot of both public sector, the government's own investments, as well as the money coming in from multilaterals and other NGOs. A lot of that will get directed towards healthcare, belatedly maybe. So there's talk that we spend a very small amount, barely 1.25 or thereabouts percentage of our GDP on health. And we've underinvested for years. Now those fault lines have certainly opened up. Both health and education, both of which are so critical if you want to kind of create a working population that is healthy and fit for the new economy. So I think maybe that's the only other positive takeaway from this, that it might force us to relook at our public investments in our public healthcare system and in our public schooling system. A lot of work is going on. There's hope that belatedly we may have realized the mistake we made.
In your view,
There,
what would be for foreign companies operating in India and with employees there or part-time workers there or anything like that, what would be the most constructive thing that they could be doing right now to address their employees, their customers? Um, who's doing that right, and what can we learn from that?
okay, I'll give you a couple of examples, and maybe this is more the exception rather than the rule. There's one of the Germany's largest wind power companies, which has come back to India after a gap of almost 12 years, and they're setting up a large R&D facility in India. Their global R&D facility, and they've kind of seen this crisis as an opportunity to scoop up a lot of valuable talent, R&D talent. And they're saying we're very excited about the kind of talent they're coming across, because the wind energy sector is going through a massive consolidation, right? Other than GE, Siemens, Enercon, and Vestas, most of the other players, including Suzlon, which is a large Indian player, was on the verge of bankruptcy. So there will be consolidation. There will be opportunities to really scoop up, both assets as well as talent, and I'm hearing some of that as well. But that will only, I think, apply to companies who are in that phase of growth where they're almost setting up base from scratch. Most of the other companies are not going to hire now because they don't want to add costs at a situation at a time when there's going to be a huge demand contraction. So both talent and M&A will be interesting. There have been a lot of people who were in hiring mode. I know of a large multinational company that had hired a CEO who relocated from the US and found himself stuck in Bombay when he was supposed to join in Bangalore. And the national lockdown created a situation where he couldn't take charge. But you won't believe it. The company managed to, I think, complete the whole process of onboarding him from Bombay itself. And he's joined and he's taken charge. So I guess adversity brings out the best in people. You see a lot of companies, I think, stepping up. One hears about Mercedes, for instance. They've started using their facilities to make ventilators. And Uber's kind of, as I'd mentioned earlier, stepped up and tried to collaborate on delivery of healthcare workers, a transport solution for healthcare workers. So there has been, I think, certainly recognition that this is a great time for them to step up and be known as great employer brands.
Mm-hmm. Any feelings on that, Anirudh?
No, Indrajit knows far more about these things than I do. So I think many of these companies are stepping up, and most companies, like I heard another, I think, European MNC CEO in an interview talking about how for them the employee comes first and what they're doing about employee engagement, their mental health, employing counselors, for example, who are available to the employees 24/7 to speak to them, because there's a lot of stress that the employees and everyone is going through. So, and I also heard on the other side of an IT services company, which kind of insisted when their employees wanted to work from home to say, no, they had to come into office. And this was in Bangalore. And so they insisted that they come to office till there's an official national lockdown. So clearly there'll be differentiation. I'm sure these employees will remember this when the time comes. And when companies like Mercedes and others, or Uber, or this other European multinational, which has risen to the occasion, whether it's for the employees, whether for the larger society, it will pay them dividends in some ways.
Indrajit, so any other tips on how like medium-sized companies that are operating in India can really win over their their customers, or be of assistance right now? You mentioned the big ones, and I think that those are helpful examples for us to the extent that some might be able to figure out how to do similar things, but I'm curious about if there's anything else that comes to mind about medium-sized companies.
Yeah, so I think the opportunities will spring from the fact that I think human behavior has certainly gone through a massive reset in a lot of businesses. Whether it's whether you talk about telemedicine, for instance. I think India kind of pushed through a new protocol. It wasn't allowed under the law. So you will find a lot of small to medium size, even some startups who are kind of starting to step into that space and try and create a platform for telemedicine at a time like the lockdown. It's a great service to kind of launch. Schools, for instance, lots of national schools, I think, are creating either chains or smaller, schools are kind of stepping up education. And I think that's where another major reset has already happened. Teachers who certainly were not willing to give online education a try have been forced to do it because schools are shut, colleges are shut, and our kids, for instance, are sitting at home and working on Google Hangout and Zoom and attending classes. So I think those are the kind of opportunities that you'll probably start to see. Online education is certainly going to take off because people are looking at reskilling during this time. And I think there's certainly a recognition that, people need to, I think, focus on new set of skills that they perhaps haven't focused on. So the skilling area, reskilling area, schools, logistics, again, is a big area which will throw up a lot of demand because goods need to be moved from one place to the other. India faces a lot of friction. And I know of a lot of logistics businesses that are taking off. And the logistics ecosystems, whether it's warehousing, whether it's trucking, all of that will see some consolidation, but I think there'll still be scope for technology to come in agriculture as well. There is a lot of interesting work going on to collect, fresh fruit and vegetables from the farm and deliver it to the large chains. So that's another area for small and medium-sized businesses, but that's where technology will certainly play. So you can't avoid, kind of large deployment of technology solutions.
Do you think that for universities, this has changed the behavior of students to an extent that universities that might not have been able to operate within India via virtual classes, that now that could become a reality?
Julian, I think it's a capability issue there in higher education. I've covered this in the past, and I know the government itself had a massive online program called Swayam. But I think you'll find that the Coursera's of the world have actually done far better. They've got about 50,000 people already enrolled for some of their degree courses out of India. India is one of the largest markets for Coursera. Even from a B2B kind of perspective, a lot of institutions, companies are kind of using Coursera courses to train people. The universities have tried to partner with the likes of Coursera to open up courses in areas like AI. I know one of the best colleges in Bombay, which is, I think, tied up with Coursera, is at least working on a course on AI, which they believe has to be mandatory for every college student. So there will be demand. And this is clearly a great opportunity to, again, press the reset button on online education, clearly.
So we started just a little bit late and we've gone a little bit over. So do we have any final comments, anything that we missed, things that you think that folks should know and understand?
Anirudh?
Anirudh? Anirudh?
I think his...
Oh, somehow you got muted.
Okay.
There you are.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
There you are, yes.
While, the number of tests being conducted remains abysmally low, the fact is, from the hospitals that I've spoken to, some of the private sector hospitals, one, they're not seeing an increased number of patients, whether small or large hospitals, and neither has the crude death rate gone up. So there's some reason to believe that whatever numbers we are seeing is is not too off the mark of where the real situation is. And if that is the case, then there's reason to be hopeful.
Any parting comments, IG?
Yeah, so I think everyone's kind of quite honestly tensed at this point in time. We don't know what the future holds in some ways, but I think there's reason to believe that if you're the sort of person or the business leader who is not kind of phased by this kind of disruptive change, and you can hold your team together, and we are seeing quite a bit of that. There is a lot more attempt to try and communicate, as Conrad was saying, try and offer counseling services and all of that. I think if we can keep the flock through a radical disruptive change of this kind, we might really come out stronger at the end of it. So that's the hope, certainly.
Okay. I also hope that too. Well, I hope that you're both staying safe and as well as you can be. And I really appreciate you taking the time out to be with us today. We're continuing to get our programming on a regular basis, and it's some of it's Slack chats, some of it's video, but it's going well, and we're getting a lot of productive feedback. So to the folks watching this, let us know what you think. Come and join the Slack group if you're not already in it, and we'll come back with more programming. You can find us on covidresponsenetwork.com. Anirudh, IG, thank you so much for making time for us today. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and have a good day, Julian. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Bye. Bye.